Rain struck the tall windows of Courtroom 14 like 1,000 tiny fists trying to break through the glass. Inside, the overhead fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent hymn, casting everything in the flat, unforgiving pallor of institutional judgment. The gallery was half full, colleagues of Dominic, a few journalists covering the divorce of a moderately successful real estate developer, and Vanessa Sinclair, seated in the second row with her legs crossed and her chin lifted, as though she were watching a show staged exclusively for her entertainment. And there, at the respondents' table, sat Eleanor Catherine Voss. She sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap, one resting gently over the other. Oh, the way a woman folds her hands in a waiting room when she knows the diagnosis, but has decided not to cry in front of strangers. Her charcoal dress blended into the muted tones of the courtroom. No jewellery caught the light. No perfume announced her presence. She was to every pair of eyes in that room exactly what they had decided she was. A quiet, middle-aged woman at the end of a marriage she had failed to hold together, sitting in the wreckage of someone else's choices with nothing left to negotiate. Dominic Voss leaned back in his chair at the petitioner's table and adjusted his cufflinks with the slow, deliberate satisfaction of a man who had already written the final chapter. He glanced at Eleanor, not with hatred, not even with pity, but with the mild, dismissive gaze one gives to furniture being removed from a room you are redecorating. Gerald Whitmore shuffled his papers beside Dominic, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had reviewed Eleanor's financial disclosures, a modest savings account, a 10-year-old sedan, no property in her name, no investments, no trust, no family money worth mentioning. On paper, she was a woman who had spent 16 years as a homemaker and had nothing to show for it but a quiet voice and an outdated wardrobe. Clear throat. What none of them knew, not Dominic, not Whitmore, not the smirking woman in the second row, not a single soul in that gallery, was that the quietest person in the room was also the most powerful. But that revelation would come later. For now, Eleanor Voss simply sat and breathed, and waited with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that silence is not the absence of power. It is the sound power makes right before it speaks. Gerald Whitmore rose to his feet with the theatrical confidence of a man who had won cases far more complex than this, and considered this particular morning little more than a formality. "Your Honour," he began, his voice filling the courtroom with practised authority. "My client Dominic Voss has been more than generous in his proposed settlement. He has offered Mrs. Voss a one-time payment of $120,000, continued health coverage for 12 months, and the contents of the family home, excluding, of course, the art collection and the vehicles, which were purchased with his income." He paused, letting the word, his land like a gavel. "Mrs. Voss, that by her own financial disclosure, has no income, no assets, and no professional credentials. She has been, for the entirety of this marriage, a dependent. We believe the proposed settlement reflects both fairness and reality." He sat down. Dominic nodded slowly beside him, his expression one of magnanimous patience, as though he were donating to a charity rather than discarding the woman who had shared his bed for 16 years. A murmur rippled through the gallery. A woman behind Vanessa whispered, "She really has nothing," and her companion shook her head with a pitying smile. If you are listening to this story right now and you have ever been underestimated, if anyone has ever looked through you as though you were made of glass, stay with this story to the very end. Because what happens next in this courtroom will stay with you for a long, long time. Martin Cross, Eleanor's attorney, rose with an unhurried calm. "Your Honour, we are not yet prepared to respond to the settlement proposal. We request the court's patience. We will present our position in full today." Whitmore let out a short, incredulous laugh, barely concealed, just loud enough for the gallery. "Your Honour, with respect, the respondent has had 6 months to prepare a counter-proposal. If she has nothing to present, perhaps that tells the court everything it needs to know." A few people in the gallery chuckled. Dominic turned to look at Eleanor with raised eyebrows, as though silently asking, "Did you really come here with nothing?" Eleanor did not move. She did not look at him. Her grey-green eyes remained fixed on the middle distance, her breathing even, her posture as composed as cathedral stone. The rain continued its assault on the windows, and in the cold fluorescent light, she looked like a woman already defeated, already forgotten. Vanessa Sinclair uncrossed and recrossed her legs, drawing a glance from a male journalist in the front row. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on Eleanor, with the sharp, satisfied gaze of a woman who had taken everything and wanted the former owner to witness the inventory. She whispered something to the woman beside her, and they both smiled, the particular smile of cruelty that believes itself to be confidence. Judge Morehouse studied Eleanor over the rim of her glasses for a long moment. "Mr. Cross," she said, "the court will allow your client time to present her position, but I trust we will not be wasting the court's time." "We will not, Your Honour," Martin said, and something in the way he said it, some quiet, absolute certainty in those 4 words, should have alarmed Gerald Whitmore. It should have sent a cold finger down Dominic Voss's spine. It should have made Vanessa Sinclair uncross her legs and sit up straight. But it did not. Clears throat. Because arrogance is a kind of deafness. It hears only its own echo. And everyone in that courtroom who had decided Eleanor Voss was nothing had been listening to their own voices for so long that they could not hear the storm building inside her silence. Dominic leaned toward Whitmore and whispered, loud enough for Eleanor to hear, intentionally loud enough. Not because small cruelties were his favourite language. This should be over by lunch. I have a reservation at Marcello's. Whitmore chuckled. Make it for 3. Bring the girlfriend. Dominic's grin widened. He did not look at Eleanor again. She was already behind him, already in the past, already a footnote in the story he was telling himself about his life. He could not have been more wrong. To understand what was about to happen in Courtroom 14, you must understand a story that began long before Eleanor ever met Dominic Voss, a story she had carried in silence for her entire adult life, like a diamond sewn into the lining of an ordinary coat. Eleanor Catherine Ashford was born into quiet, immense and deliberate wealth. Her grandmother, Helen Ashford Chen, had built Ashford Continental Holdings from a single hospitality property in Geneva in 1971 into one of the most powerful privately held conglomerates in the Western Hemisphere. The company's tendrils reached into luxury hotel chains across 14 countries, rare earth mineral extraction contracts in 3 continents, a European real estate portfolio valued at over $1.8 billion, and a pharmaceutical research division that held patents generating revenue in the hundreds of millions annually. At the time of Helen's death in 2017, the family's net worth was conservatively estimated at $4.7 billion, but the Ashford family did not appear on magazine covers. They did not attend galas. They did not own yachts with names. Helen Ashford Chen had built her empire on a single, yet unshakable principle. True power does not perform. It operates. It moves in silence. It never, ever needs to be believed. Eleanor was Helen's only grandchild, and Helen had raised her from the age of 7 after Eleanor's parents died in a private plane accident over the Swiss Alps. She raised her not with luxury, but with discipline, not with display, but with discernment. Eleanor attended local schools, wore simple clothes, was taught to listen before speaking, to observe before acting, and to never reveal the full architecture of her resources to anyone who had not earned that knowledge. When Eleanor married Dominic Voss at 25, she was already the sole heir to the Ashford estate, but she told him nothing. She wanted to be loved as Eleanor, not as a fortune, not as a portfolio, not as a last name attached to a balance sheet. She wore no family ring. She listed no family connections. She entered the marriage as a woman with a small savings account and a gentle voice, and Dominic never once thought to look deeper, because Dominic Voss was the kind of man who measured people by what they displayed, and Eleanor displayed nothing. For 16 years, while Dominic built his moderately successful real estate firm and believed himself to be the sole provider, Eleanor had been quietly managing, growing and restructuring her family's empire through a private board of directors, a Geneva-based legal team, and a network of holding companies layered across 4 jurisdictions. She conducted board calls from the bathroom while Dominic slept. She reviewed acquisition proposals in the quiet hours of the morning, disguised as reading novels on her tablet. She flew to Zurich and Singapore under the pretense of visiting old school friends. She had acquired controlling interests in 2 of the largest commercial real estate firms on the eastern seaboard, firms that, unbeknownst to Dominic, held the mortgages and commercial leases on 3 of his own properties. She had funded a medical research foundation in her grandmother's name that had become one of the top private donors to neurological research in Europe. She owned, through a chain of holding companies, the very building in which Dominic's office occupied the 14th floor, clears throat, and she had done all of this in absolute silence, not out of deception, but out of a philosophy inherited from a woman who believed that wealth without wisdom is just noise, and that the people who truly deserve your truth are the ones who see you without it. Dominic had never seen her, not once, not in 16 years. He had looked at her every morning across the breakfast table and seen a quiet, agreeable woman who ironed his shirts and packed their daughter's lunch and never once challenged his authority. He did not know that the hands that ironed his shirts also signed acquisition documents worth more than his entire company. He did not know that the woman he called ordinary held more financial power in her left hand than he would accumulate in 3 lifetimes. And when he began his affair with Vanessa Sinclair, When he came home smelling of another woman's perfume and looked at Eleanor with the dismissive impatience of a man who has outgrown a garment, Eleanor did not scream. She did not beg. She did not break. She called Martin Cross, and she began to build the most meticulous, devastating, and legally airtight case a divorce court in the city had ever seen. Back in the courtroom, Dominic Voss sat with the posture of a man who believed the world was a stage built specifically for his comfort. The morning session had recessed for 15 minutes, and the gallery buzzed with low, anticipatory murmurs. Dominic stood near the tall window, coffee in hand, laughing with Gerald Whitmore, while the rain painted silver veins down the glass behind them. Vanessa had joined them, standing too close to Dominic, or her hand resting on his forearm with the proprietary confidence of a woman who had already mentally redecorated the marital home. She didn't even bring a counter-proposal, Vanessa said, her voice carrying a light musical cruelty. What is she going to ask for? The Tupperware? Dominic laughed, a rich, careless sound. She'll take the $120,000 and be grateful. She has nowhere else to go. Whitmore nodded, adjusting his glasses. I've seen this 100 times. The homemaker wife with no assets, no career, no leverage. She'll settle. They always settle. Across the room, Eleanor stood alone near the far wall, holding a paper cup of water. She did not sip from it. She held it, the way a person holds something simply to have a reason to stand still. Martin Cross approached her and spoke quietly into her ear. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. A young female journalist in the gallery had been watching Eleanor since the session began. She could not explain why, but something about the woman's stillness unsettled her. Not the stillness of defeat, but the stillness of a held breath. She made a note in her pad. Respondent eerily calm. No visible distress. Composure doesn't match situation. She was the only person in the room paying attention. The bailiff called the court back to order. Everyone returned to their seats. Judge Morehouse entered, and the room rose and sat again with the mechanical rhythm of institutional routine. Dominic settled into his chair and adjusted his Rolex, a gesture so habitual it had become a kind of nervous signature, though he would never have admitted to nerves. He was not nervous, he was impatient. Well, he wanted this finished. He wanted Eleanor signed away, stamped, filed, and forgotten so he could begin the next chapter, the one with Vanessa and the penthouse, and the life unencumbered by the quiet, colourless woman he had married in what he now considered a youthful error of judgment. He glanced once more at Eleanor. She sat as she had before, hands folded, eyes forward, breathing steady. The overhead light caught the thin silver watch on her wrist, and for one fraction of a second something flickered in his mind, a question, a shadow, an instinct, but he dismissed it as quickly as it arrived. Clear his throat. If he had listened to that instinct, if he had paused and looked, truly looked, at the woman he had spent 16 years beside, he might have seen what the young journalist had seen. But Dominic Voss had never truly looked at Eleanor, and now it was too late to start. Gerald Whitmore stood for what he believed would be the final motion of the morning. Your Honour, he said, straightening his red power tie, before the respondent presents her position, if indeed she has one, I would like to enter into record the complete financial disclosure provided by Mrs. Voss. He lifted a thin document, conspicuously thin, and held it up for the court to see. A savings account containing $14,600, a 2016 Honda Accord with 63,000 miles, no retirement account, no investments, no trust fund, no inheritance. He paused, letting the silence do its work. Your Honour, this is the financial profile of a woman who contributed nothing of economic value to this marriage. My client built his business, his reputation, and his fortune without any financial assistance from Mrs. Voss. The idea that she is entitled to anything beyond what has been generously offered is, frankly, an insult to the court's time. He sat down with the satisfied finality of a man closing a book he found poorly written. Dominic looked directly at Eleanor now, and he did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He smiled at her, not a kind smile, not a regretful smile. It was the smile of a man looking at someone he had already erased, someone he considered so far beneath him that her presence in this courtroom was an inconvenience rather than a confrontation. It was the smile of absolute unchallenged contempt. And then, as though the smile were not enough, he spoke, not to the judge, not to his attorney, to Eleanor, directly, in a voice low enough to seem private, but loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. Eleanor, take the offer. Go home. This is embarrassing for both of us. The courtroom held its breath. Eleanor's eyes moved for the first time. Slowly, deliberately, they travelled from the middle distance to Dominic's face. She looked at him the way one looks at a clock that has stopped, with a kind of clinical detachment, noting the exact moment something ceased to function. She said nothing, and then with the smallest movement, a gesture so subtle that only those watching closely would have caught it, she turned to Martin Cross and gave a single, almost invisible nod. Martin Cross rose to his feet. If you have ever been told you are not enough, if anyone has ever looked at you and decided you have nothing to offer, then what you're about to hear is for you. Do not stop listening now. Clear his throat. The rain had intensified outside, hammering the tall windows as though the sky itself understood that something was about to shift. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The courtroom waited, and Martin Cross opened the file that would change everything. Martin Cross stood with the unhurried precision of a man who understood that timing is the difference between information and detonation. He placed a leather-bound document folder on the lectern, thick, substantial, and bearing a discreet, embossed seal that no one in the room could yet identify. He did not open it immediately. He let it sit there, or he let the weight of it become visible. "Your Honour," he began, his voice low, measured, and absolutely steady. "Opposing counsel has entered into record the financial disclosure provided by my client Eleanor Catherine Voss. That disclosure was accurate. It represents the personal accounts held under her married name." He paused. "It does not, however, represent the full scope of my client's financial position." A subtle shift passed through the courtroom. Not movement, but a tension. The air changed the way it changes before a storm breaks. Gerald Whitmore frowned slightly. Dominic tilted his head. Martin opened the folder. "Your Honour, I would like to enter into evidence the following documents. First, the Articles of Incorporation, Asset Declarations, and Board Governance Structure of Ashford Continental Holdings, which is a privately held multinational conglomerate headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland." He placed the first document on the lectern. Ashford Continental Holdings operates in 4 primary sectors: luxury hospitality, with a portfolio of 47 properties across 14 countries; rare earth mineral extraction, with active contracts in Canada, Australia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo; European commercial and residential real estate, valued at approximately $1.8 billion, and a pharmaceutical research division holding 112 active patents, generating annual licensing revenue in excess of $340 million. The courtroom had gone silent. Not quiet silent, the kind of silence that follows the first crack of lightning before the thunder arrives. And Whitmore's frown had deepened into something closer to alarm. Dominic's smile had frozen on his face like a mask whose strings had been cut. Martin continued. "The sole heir and current controlling shareholder of Ashford Continental Holdings is my client, Eleanor Catherine Ashford Voss. She inherited full ownership upon the death of her grandmother, Helen Ashford Chen, in 2017, and has served as the silent principal of the organisation's governing board for the past 9 years." He placed a second document on the lectern. "The conservatively estimated net worth of Ashford Continental Holdings, as assessed by Deloitte and independently verified by the Swiss Financial Market Supervisory Authority, is $4.7 billion. Clear his throat. Someone in the gallery gasped. It was a small sound, involuntary, like the sound a person makes when they step into freezing water. Then another. Then a murmur that spread through the rows like a flame catching dry grass. Dominic Voss did not move. He sat perfectly still, his mouth slightly open, his blue eyes fixed on Martin Cross, with the blank, uncomprehending stare of a man watching the ground open beneath him. Vanessa Sinclair's hand had risen to her mouth. Her hazel eyes were wide, darting between Eleanor and the attorney, as though trying to locate the trick, the lie, the error, some explanation that would restore the narrative she had built her ambitions upon. There was no error. Martin Cross was not finished. "Furthermore, Your Honour, I would like to enter into evidence the following additional holdings registered under Ashford Continental's subsidiary structure." He turned a page with surgical calm. "Ashford Continental holds controlling interest in Meridian Partners, one of the largest commercial real estate firms on the eastern seaboard. Meridian Partners currently holds the mortgage note on the property at 41 Lexington Terrace, which is Mr. Voss's primary office building." The murmur in the gallery became a wave. Dominic's attorney gripped his pen so hard his knuckles whitened. "Ashford Continental also holds controlling interest in Halesworth Capital, which manages the commercial lease agreements for the properties at 900 Boulevard East and 22 Harbour Point, both of which house Mr. Voss's satellite offices. In practical terms, Your Honour, my client's family company owns or controls the buildings from which Mr. Voss operates his entire business." Dominic turned to Whitmore. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Whitmore did not look at him. Whitmore was staring at the documents being handed to the judge's clerk with the expression of a man who has just realised he walked into a cathedral thinking it was a shed. Martin placed one final document on the lectern. He did this slowly, deliberately, allowing the silence to carry the weight. "Finally, Your Honour, the building in which Mr. Voss's corporate headquarters occupies the 14th floor, the Crown Atlantic Tower at 250 Central Avenue, is wholly owned by Ashford Continental Holdings. It has been owned by my client's family since 1999. He looked up from the lectern and, Ross for the first time, turned his gaze to Dominic Voss. Mr. Voss has for the past 11 years been paying rent to his wife. The courtroom erupted. Not in noise, in the kind of suspended, breathless chaos that happens when reality reorganizes itself in front of witnesses. The journalists were writing furiously. The spectators were leaning forward, whispering, their faces reflecting the specific shock of a world inverted. The woman who had whispered, "She really has nothing," now sat with her hand over her heart and tears forming in her eyes, not of pity, but of revelation. Judge Morehouse removed her glasses, cleaned them slowly, replaced them, and looked at Eleanor Voss with an expression that contained, for just a fraction of a second, something very close to admiration. "Mrs. Voss," the judge said quietly. Is there anything you would like to say at this time?" The courtroom held its breath. Eleanor Catherine Voss looked up. She unfolded her hands. She rose to her feet with the slow, unhurried grace of a woman who has spent a lifetime learning that the most powerful voice in any room is the one that waits longest to speak. She looked at Dominic, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the quiet, exhausted clarity of someone who has finally set down a burden they carried alone for far too long. And then, in a voice low and steady and clear as winter rain on glass, she spoke. "I never wanted him to know. I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I had. I gave him 16 years of that chance." She paused. The rain hammered the windows. He chose to see nothing, so now he can see everything. She sat down. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was full of every moment Dominic had looked past her, every whisper Vanessa had aimed at her back, every condescending syllable Gerald Whitmore had poured into the record. It was full of every quiet morning Eleanor had signed documents worth more than Dominic's entire net worth, while he slept beside her dreaming of small ambitions. It was the silence of Karma arriving on time, dressed in a charcoal wool dress, wearing no jewellery, and needing nothing from anyone in the room. The recess was called at 11:47. Dominic Voss did not stand immediately. He sat in his chair as the courtroom emptied around him, his hands flat on the table, his blue eyes fixed on a point in space that no longer contained the world he had understood 20 minutes ago. The Rolex on his wrist, the gold Daytona he had worn like a crown, now felt like a shackle, a trinket, a toy purchased with money he suddenly understood had been circulating through an economy his wife controlled at every level he could not see. Gerald Whitmore had gathered his papers without speaking and walked out of the courtroom with the stiff gait of a man retreating from a battlefield he had mistaken for a garden. In the hallway he would call his office and instruct his paralegal to pull every filing, every asset search, every disclosure he had reviewed, searching frantically for the failure, the oversight, the crack through which $4.7 billion had slipped past him unnoticed. He would not find it. There was no crack. There was only the simple, devastating truth that he had not looked because he had not believed there was anything to see. Vanessa Sinclair stood in the corridor outside the courtroom with her arms folded across her cream dress, her manufactured composure crumbling in real time. Her phone was in her hand, but she was not typing. She was staring at the screen as though waiting for it to offer her an explanation or an escape route or a rewind button that would take her back to the moment she had whispered, "What is she going to ask for?" The Tupperware, and let her swallow those words before they left her perfect painted lips. The young journalist, the one who had noted Eleanor's composure, was standing near the elevator, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in rapid, electric sentences to her editor. "No, I'm not exaggerating. Ashford Continental. Uncle 4.7 billion. Yes, billion. She's been the controlling shareholder the entire time. The husband had no idea. He was paying rent to her company. I need front page for the morning edition." If this story is making your heart beat faster right now, if you feel something rising in your chest that feels like justice, then press that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this one are what this channel was built for. Inside the courtroom, only 3 people remained. Eleanor sat in her chair unmoved, her hands returned to their folded position. Martin Cross stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair in a gesture of quiet solidarity. And Dominic sat across the aisle, close enough to speak to her, but separated by a distance that could no longer be measured in feet. But he turned to her, his face had changed. The tan looked sallow now, the charming jaw slack, the blue eyes stripped of their practiced sparkle and left raw and exposed, like windows, with the curtains torn down. When he spoke, his voice cracked, not with sorrow, but with the specific brittle sound of a man hearing his own smallness for the first time. "Eleanor!" His voice was barely audible. "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at him. The grey-green eyes held no anger, no satisfaction, only the deep, luminous sadness of a woman who had handed someone her whole heart disguised as an ordinary life and watched them throw it away because the wrapping wasn't expensive enough. "I did tell you, Dominic," she said softly. "Every day, in every meal I cooked, every shirt I pressed, every night I stayed. I told you who I was. You just never thought it was worth knowing." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. She gathered her coat from the back of her chair, buttoned it slowly, and walked toward the courtroom doors. She did not look back. The doors closed behind her with a sound that, to Dominic Voss, echoed like the final syllable of a language he had never learned. 6 months later, the morning light over Geneva broke gold and clean across the lake, and Eleanor Catherine Ashford stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Ashford Continental Headquarters, a building her grandmother had purchased in 1984, when this stretch of lakeshore was still considered unfashionable, with the foresight of a woman who understood that true value is always invisible before it becomes obvious. Eleanor wore a black cashmere blazer. A single strand of her grandmother's pearls, her dark chestnut hair, fell loose past her shoulders for the first time in years, no longer pulled into the tight, self-effacing bun of a woman trying to disappear. She looked like exactly what she was, the quiet architect of an empire built on silence, patience, and an unshakable belief that dignity is not weakness and gentleness is not surrender. The divorce had been finalized in a single session after the reveal. The settlement, restructured entirely, had awarded Eleanor full custody, the family home, and a financial arrangement that reflected the actual power dynamics of the marriage rather than the performance Dominic had staged for 16 years. His business, dependent on leases and mortgages controlled by Ashford Continental, had been allowed to continue operating. Not out of obligation, but out of Eleanor's quiet insistence that cruelty was a currency she refused to trade in, even when she held every card. Vanessa Sinclair had disappeared from Dominic's life within weeks. Dominic himself had been seen leaving his diminished office building carrying a single box, his Rolex conspicuously absent from his wrist, his face carrying the permanent, haunted expression of a man who had learned too late that the thing he discarded was the thing that held everything together. If this story moved something inside you, if it reminded you that the quietest people in the room are often carrying the greatest power, then leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Eleanor turned from the window. On her desk lay a framed photograph, not of the courtroom, not of the settlement documents, not of any monument to victory. It was a photograph of her grandmother, Helen Ashford Chen, standing in front of the very first hotel in Geneva, 1971, wearing a plain dress and no jewellery, smiling the small, private smile of a woman who knew exactly what she was building and needed no one else to see it. Eleanor touched the frame with her fingertips, clear as throat. She whispered, "They see me now, grandmother." Then she sat down at her desk, opened the morning's first file, and continued in silence, in strength, in the immovable certainty that the people who matter will always eventually see your light, not because you shone it in their eyes, but because it was too bright to hide forever. And remember, never underestimate the quiet ones, because one day, the person you dismissed as nothing will turn out to be everything you could never become.